If respected polls are to be believed, it is a topic that is seriously dividing this nation. Just what is the role of religion in the government of the United States? Coming up on Consider This, the first of two shows on this controversial subject. This week, supporters of the separation of church and state.
The 9th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Sunday at 5 p.m.
Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news. Once again, from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome once again to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. We have a situation in this country where religion is becoming a focal point, and more specifically, separation of church and state. We're hearing it a lot lately in the news. We've got the issue of school vouchers, our Supreme Court nominees, what are their religious and moral beliefs? We can't even stop the teaching of creationism in schools, or as they're calling it now, intelligent design. My guests this week are concerned about the preservation of the separation of church and state. I mean, that's a mouthful. Mark Hager is vice president of a group called Americans United for Separation of Church and State.
Nebraska chapter.
Nebraska chapter, but you're still a member.
Yes.
And Reverend Nancy Brink is pastor at Northside Christian Church, and she is with the Disciples of Christ denomination, just for point of clarification for those who will wonder. This whole thing is beginning to divide America seriously, and it seems to be pitting those who are concerned about this separation against those who believe that we're trying to, they're fighting what I think Pat Robertson perhaps called this, or James Dobson called the second Civil War, which is, they feel, is the purging of religion from everything. So the issue is separation of church and state, and you're involved in this organization, and obviously you feel very strongly about this.
I mean, I think...
You godless person.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, actually, I think both of us, we don't have a lot of diversity, because I think both of us are Christians and very devout ones. So I think it's, one of the things that's interesting is how the nation is really suffering from a very specific and calculated attempt to try to drive a wedge between us. And in fact, I think that one of the brilliant things about the Constitution is that it was designed specifically to try to bring us together and to force us into finding compromise and tolerance for each other, rather than allowing one specific, this is the truth, this is, you know, a sort of ideological purity.
To frame this a little better, and I should have done that better in the beginning, is that the religious right and the pole of the religious right, or the clout that they've worked to get within the Bush administration, has sort of crystallized this battle. Right. And so, it started long ago, but in fact, your organization was started in 1947.
In the 40s, it's been around
so
for a long time,
it's not a new issue.
Right.
But we saw a lot in the last election, particularly, that it was an issue of a moral person versus an immoral person, or a person who was really Christian versus a person who was, you know, a different kind of Christian.
Right.
And I guess I'm becoming a little weary of that, because I don't know if we're threatened, but many people believe this is a threat, that you're trying to take even the mention of God out of everything.
And I think that's, jump in here, but I mean, I think that trying to define things in those either-or kind of categories is one of the tricks. You're either with us or you're against us. You're either believe in what we believe, or you're godless. And of course, when you're presented with those kind of diametrically opposed choices, then it looks like there is only one sort of logical choice. You're either moral and with us, or you're amoral. Well, there's lots of other choices that are not with those political ideological beliefs, and still would fall, I think, squarely into the category of moral choices.
And our Constitution really protects us from the tyranny of the majority.
Hey, well, let me read it says the First Amendment says this is Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion
Right.
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So I'm not a constitutional expert.
And
How
I
do,
think,
how do you see that?
See, this is one of the things that is often portrayed is to say, well,
You're advocating freedom from religion.
oh, yes, that's right, or that somehow that religion cannot be part of the cultural life of America. In fact, the Constitution specifically protects religion as a cultural force, a moral force in our society, and that's its proper role. But it separates that moral force from the rule of law. And one reason why religion thrives in America is specifically because of that. We've seen where in Europe, where the state and the church became one, and where the church became an instrument of political power, that people then rose up against it and dismissed it as a corrupt institution. One reason why America has maintained the legitimacy of religion as a moral force is because it has been able to be outside of that political process and to speak from what's prophetic is the right
Absolutely.
is the way to call that, with a prophetic voice to challenge institutions rather than being. I mean, I'm a Lutheran, and our whole church is based around a guy who stood up and said, look, this is wrong. The fact that the emperor and the pope are the same thing, that the church controls the political apparatus, that they own property, that they are controlling our daily political lives and economic lives, that corrupts the church. We need to separate and pull back from that and go back to the core of what, in our case, Christianity is, which is to be a moral force as opposed to a political force.
Let's talk about some of the specific issues that have come up and
Sure.
just seem to be galvanizing this whole us versus them kind of thing. Right now, I think the issue of the next Supreme Court, or the current Supreme Court nominee, who will be fill out the Supreme Court.
Right.
And this has come up in the last several nominations of. Do they meet this litmus test? And they say, the last couple of presidents, that I'm not looking for a litmus test, but in the current administration, it is clear there is a litmus test. In fact, when Harriet Miers was appointed, the one side of the aisle, the Democrats, were concerned that there wasn't she hadn't been a judge, therefore there wasn't a paper trail.
Right.
But then they did find something, and then the other extreme, the right wing of the Republican Party, said that they found a statement that said she wasn't absolutely against abortion under all circumstances. So then didn't meet their litmus test. So how can we have a litmus test and doesn't have to be religious?
And judges are all the time having to make decisions that may go against their personal moral religious values, but they are not beholden to their particular churches or synagogues or whatever tradition, their particular viewpoint, but beholden to the rule of law.
Or they recuse themselves if they.
Or they must recuse themselves, absolutely. And there are a lot of things that we need for the public good that may be against any particular religious traditions.
Okay, give
practice.
me a for instance.
Well, there's been landmark cases, say, about some of the Native American tribes who use peyote in their worship. So that is a controlled substance. It's against the law, and our courts had to settle whether or not that could be used. There's always this tension, and I think that's a healthy tension in a creative democratic society, to have this sense of law being greater than any particular individual's theological beliefs at the moment.
Let's go back, and maybe you know your history better than I do, because I don't. But I remember when I was studying history at a very young age, even though it was mostly memorizations of dates and things. We learned about Hammurabi's Code, and then the Magna Carta, and the sort of the evolution of our lawful government.
Right.
And then, yes, the Puritans and the Judeo-Christian ethic did play a part. But the people that ruled this country, the only ones there were basically Jews or Christians, because there were slaves, and their religion, if they had it, didn't count.
Yeah, right.
So it was kind of exclusionary from as far, but that was just the
But
fact. Those were the people.
There were Unitarians, there were Quakers, there were Shakers, there were a lot of different, one of the myths that have been promoted recently from this group is the sort of notion that we were a Christian nation when we were founded.
Right.
And they've gone so far as to even make up quotes that have been put in the mouths of founding fathers. But if you look at the history, I mean, obviously the majority of them were in fact Christians, but to various degrees of devoutness. Several were Unitarians. And one of the reasons they settled on the word creator as opposed to God was to be more inclusive in that language rather than more specific. And again, because they had been through and seen what had happened in Europe when you have a church-state relationship that corrupts both.
And when you're the minority, because most of them, those who came to the United States for religious freedom from Europe, came because they were the minority.
And that
they
includes
were
the
discriminated.
Puritans, who were very strict in their particular Christian, what they thought made them a good Christian.
And so again, it is true that they never meant to try to be anti-religious. Specifically what they wanted to do, though, was to make sure the state never became an instrument in repressing one religion over another, that all religions would have a place at the table and could share equally at the sharing of the power that is a democracy.
I understand, though, where some folks are coming from who have seen a deliberate and legal stripping of some of the things that were considered traditional rights by
Like what?
prayer in the schools. And the one nation under God. Granted, it didn't start out with those words in the Pledge of Allegiance, but it was, it went in the Truman era, and then it came. And then, it's always that the ACLU or an atheist or an agnostic who comes in, and so I don't know if there is a real threat or if it's just a perceived threat, because the ones who file these cases, who want to manipulate the status quo, whether it's right or wrong, but want to manipulate the way they felt comfortable that we can at least live with this minimum amount of God mentioned, seem to be those that are non-religious at all.
Sure, but I think I think that's a characterization that maybe isn't true, because I think there are lots of other religious people and organizations.
And there are religious people involved in the ACLU, but it seems to stand for
sure,
something.
that's right. But again, that's that attempt to try to divide us by saying you're either on our side and believe in God, or you're one of those godless people, and that's just not true. I mean, we both believe very much in our own individual faiths and in God itself, but many times these become political footballs for raising money and getting people whipped up into a frenzy.
Well, the perfect example of that is, and this isn't my opinion, the numbers would somewhat bear it out, that Karl Rove, who works for the president, part of his strategy in knowing that an election could be tight was to work to get the gay marriage issue on state ballots.
Absolutely.
And that was what I call a frenzy issue,
That's
working
right.
people up to a
Because
frenzy,
he knew the
regardless of people's opinion on it, that it would bring out their element.
Activation.
And there's nothing wrong with wanting to bring out your element. That's how elections work. It's been going on for years. Get out our vote.
When I get into some of these arguments with people, I like to kind of turn the tables on them, and I say, okay, let's take prayer in schools, for instance. I had a discussion with someone recently about that. Let's say it's legalized. So in my daughter's school, there are all 4 types of Judaism represented. There are Roman Catholics, there's all brands of Protestants, there are Mormons, there are Hindus, and I know of at least one Buddhist. So are we
Whose
going to
prayer?
have, well, I think, are we going to have a lottery? So are you ready for your child to be praying a Hindu prayer? Are you ready for your child to go from an Orthodox Jewish prayer to a Protestant prayer. You know, actually, that might be quite creative.
It would be. I mean, but I doubt
but
that
I-
the people on
people's
those.
that's what they have in
perception,
mind.
absolutely. People's perception is we would go back to the way things were when the perception was we were a homogeneous religious society, which never was the case. But it was our perception of that.
And it was more homogeneous, so it was easier. But
Well,
There were probably still people that
I
left a
grew up
little out
in
the
West
cold.
Texas, and we had prayer in public schools. Half of my town was migrant farm workers from Mexico who had begun to settle in the community. They were Roman Catholic. The Anglo folks were basically all varieties of Protestants. We had prayer in public schools, but I do not remember one Mexican American student ever asked to pray. It was always Protestant. That's also who controlled the courthouse, the teachers, the school system. That was who was in charge. And we might love it if we're in charge, but our country is changing.
And that's the danger, is that when religion is used as a political force as opposed to a moral force, when it's used by those who want to impose a uniformity on people, that's when the danger arises. And it's great if you're on their side.
Do you mean this kind of uniformity? E. James Kennedy saying, "This is our land, this is our world, this is our heritage, and with God's help we shall reclaim this nation for Jesus Christ, and no power on earth can stop us." What I'm saying, a lot of people are in the middle. They'd like maybe to see, you know, go back to the days when there was prayer in the school, because they realize that our society's gotten a little, we're concerned for our children and give them moral leadership. But when I hear things like I just read, then it becomes clear that the agenda of not all of the people who would like to see prayer in school, but it's certainly a core of them, and the most vocal ones have one agenda, and that is Christianity. And I'm a Christian too, and I should do a better job of evangelizing in my own personal
and what
life.
offends me about that statement is the hijacking of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And that's the danger of this kind of interaction. In other words, these people have a clear political agenda, and God bless them, that's their right. They have a right to organize, do all those sorts of things. But then to try to put, you know, a cardboard cutout of Jesus standing next to them as if he's endorsing, you know, their position, is just not true. I mean, and often he is anti-scriptural in a lot of ways.
And anti-historical. I mean, who was here first? And that is a Holocaust.
Yeah.
That is a Holocaust that we Christians don't like to talk about. You know,
So-
the
You
first
Get
one,
literal about that.
that's right.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's right.
Our first one was
You know,
not in Europe.
The other thing that bothers me on some of these kind of rulings is often, you know, the court will rule to the extent they favor them. They do so by trivializing religion. So, for example, when they ruled almost 10, 15 years ago now, that it was all right for cities to display nativity scenes on public property, they did so on the basis of saying, well, you know, it's no different than Frosty the Snowman or Santa Claus or, you know, reindeer or elves, so we'll just throw Jesus in there as well, too. It's a harmless sort of cultural display. Well, you know, as somebody who feels that, you know, the representation of Christ is not in the same category as Frosty the Snowman, and to me, it's a disrespect of religion to even begin to say that this isn't important.
I found the rulings, and they're bringing this up a lot lately by the Supreme Court on the Ten Commandments, for instance, that in certain cases is okay and not. Now, if you read, and I haven't read the actual decisions, but I've read reputable summaries of them, just pretty objective, is that they said if it was included, if it was put there as an historical reference to that portion that part that we draw some of our law from, you know, thou shalt not kill.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's probably, you know, kind of where they got that idea from, that it was okay.
Sure.
But then there's going to be, but now they won't let any because they'll know we're on to them, and we'll.
Of course, most of them were placed there as promotions for the movie The Ten Commandments. That's an interesting fact, that they were originally Eagles clubs were arms of theater chains. They were sort of service clubs they organized, and when the big Ten Commandments film with Yul Brynner and all this sort of stuff came
Cecil
out.
B's.
And Cecil B. DeMille's, and they came up with this great idea of placing these Ten Commandment tablets all around the country, and you had little dedications for them. So basically, these folks are fighting to maintain, movie promotions as
Originally a
primary-
movie
Yes,
promotion.
right.
One of the things that I've heard a lot about in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina is how good the faith-based organizations were in helping them. And there seems to be, of all the things, the kinds of things that you're concerned about, religion in public schools, vouchers for religious school funding, religious symbols on public property, the one that, if properly done, seems to bother me the least, I think of the Salvation Army.
Sure.
There's no doubt that's faith-based.
Right, yeah.
But I have never, I know a lot of people that have been served by them, but never have they been proselytized.
Yeah.
They are an organization that happens to be religious. There are many nonprofit organizations that aren't religious in nature, but they have sort of a moral imperative. But if they're doing their job and they meet certain requirements about not proselytizing, and such as the Salvation Army, what's the big deal?
Well, I think you said it right correctly when you said if done correctly. And we have a long tradition of nonprofits that have religious affiliations receiving federal dollars to perform specific sorts of tasks.
Especially when there's a void in a community that.
Absolutely.
And that was around long before George Bush came on the scene.
So what's
The difference is the new faith-based initiative removes a lot of the accountability that has traditionally gone with this money. In other words, if you receive federal dollars, there were very specific reporting kinds of things you had to do. You had to show where the money went, how it was spent, what was the outcome of how that money was spent. That's been eliminated.
Well,
under
it's
this.
taxpayer.
That's taxpayer dollars,
I'd
right?
like that, regardless
Right.
of.
And these organizations are allowed to discriminate any way that they want. In fact, there's just been a recent case where the Salvation Army is still allowed to discriminate. They discriminate in hiring, say, against gay and lesbian people, for instance.
Right.
But most of their funding comes from federal dollars. I have a problem with that.
My
You know.
father ran a faith-based organization for years and years, the Good Samaritan Society, that basically deals with geriatric issues. And he was just livid when the federal government told him that he has to hire potentially gay and lesbian administrators. But
So then-
that was the law. He had to
So
obey
you
it.
can take it or leave it.
You
I mean, you
can
still
take
have
it
that
or leave it.
choice.
But Medicare was such an important part of that community that he served. He basically had to go along with it. Well, he's a good Lutheran pastor, so he's open-minded. So he's come around on the whole gay and lesbian issue now.
At least in terms of the hiring.
Well, and even believing, understanding that it is that he's now seen that in fact that he thinks if Christ were alive today, that in fact he would embrace gays and lesbians.
Okay, there's something interesting.
Yeah.
If Christ, let's just talk about the Christian now. I mean, I
We
think
need
that.
some Jews on the panel.
But I think the issue of other religions is more obvious
Right.
and more clear.
Right.
Right.
But there seems to be a contingent that said you can only look upon homosexuality in any form as unchristian, a sin, sin to the max,
Right.
mucho grande sin, and that everything else is wrong. And therefore we can only support anything in government that doesn't really allow them any rights.
Right.
I mean, I can understand people being conflicted on the marriage thing. I mean, I understand that it's not just they're all damned, and
Right.
it's just what they feel the definition of marriage is, and that maybe
Right,
other.
although-
But even that
I don't want to
is-
get into that
Right.
debate because,
Okay.
but the other accommodation. I mean, maybe there are, and I don't know if what is the answer, but they don't want any. And in fact, our state constitutional amendment goes farther than, and that's being tested in court.
Well, it's been struck down last
Oh,
May.
that's correct.
It's,
That's correct.
It's now being appealed, but it is still struck down.
So it'll be going to the appellate court.
Yeah, that's right.
But how do we find some discussion and
Right.
discourse on
Well,
this? This is what's missing.
That is what's missing, and again, it's that sort of hijacking. This is what happens when the dangerous mix of religion and politics, because if you enter the playing field of politics with everybody having equal say, then you can have an open discussion, debate things on their merits, make those arguments back and forth. But if one side comes in and says, oh, I have God on my side, this is what he has said, and I know that's true, so it's the end of the discussion. I mean, I'm not going to debate with God. You know, I'm happy to debate with other believers as we try to come to an accommodation or truth together, but it's very hard to have a discussion with somebody when they have said, this is what God said, and there's no compromise, that's not politics, that's not.
But it's where we were around the Civil War debate, because slavery as an institution is upheld page after page after page after page of Scripture. There is nothing in Scripture, even when Paul sends a slave back, he doesn't say free the slave, he just says treat him well. Slavery is upheld in Scripture.
Right.
What got overturned in people's religious hearts and minds was this definition that these Africans that we have brought over are less than human. When that got overturned in people's heads and hearts, they had to relook at Scripture. I think we're in that same place with the issue of gay and lesbian people. As people know about psychology, as people understand more scientifically what's going on, as people understand about brain studies, and most of all, as they realize, oh gosh, this is my son or my daughter, this is my banker, this is my musician, this is my best friend, then they go, oh, there's a new way to look at these 6 passages. One would think that it was on every other page of Scripture.
And there's also that change in the definition of marriage as well too. It used to be that when the Bible refers to marriage, it was essentially a property contract, where men owned women, and they were and their property was being shared.
We've gotten away from how we
now when we've redefined marriage as the expression of love between two people, then that changes the entire.
And it wasn't even between two people. There's only one place in Scripture.
Yeah.
In reference to bishops in one of the latest in the New Testament.
Well, we're really running out of
Okay,
time.
all right,
We have
okay.
about a minute. But the issue is, how do we, can we uncouple this religious kind of, this has to be a all or nothing with those that want.
I think we can use
Because you might be total
religious,
jerks, you know,
I think
for
we can use a
religiously, I don't know.
religious ethic, and that is a religious ethic of love. And that is not only love for people like me and like-minded people, it is a love for the common good. And I see that is so foundational to Jesus.
I do want to mention as we close the show that the Nebraska chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State this week is bringing in Robert Boston, who is the Assistant Communications Director of
a great author of many books on this whole subject. So.
And not that there's one right or the other, but I think we should all talk about it. And thanks for coming today, and be open to at least listening.
It was fun.
Thank you so much, Mark Hager and Reverend Nancy Brink. We'll see you next week on Consider This.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours.
The 9th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Sunday at 5 p.m.
Next week on Consider This, we talk with those who feel that religion and to a great degree Christian values should be at the heart of how America is governed. Join us then.